to Practical Changemakers, a carbon positive story. I'd like to acknowledge that we're speaking to you today on Wajak Noongar Budja and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Louise Tarrier and I'm the CEO of Carbon Positive Australia. Our mission is to empower and encourage everyone in Australia to take action that revitalises and improves the health of landscapes and communities. We do this via our carefully selected Australian tree planting projects and by providing inspiring education programs. Through our work, we get to talk to and spend time with people who are working for the health of our environment every day. These practical change makers and leaders don't often make the headlines, but the work that they do is vital in our changing world. It's my pleasure to introduce some of them to you and for you to hear more about their work, to be inspired and to find out ways you can also become a practical change maker. My guest today is Tina Parkhurst. Tina's an ecologist and currently works as a postdoctoral fellow at Murdoch University. As part of this role, she investigates how natural capital can be improved through ecological restoration investments with a particular focus on agricultural landscapes. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. And Tina and I got to know each other through our combined project at Eurardy Reserve when Tina was working with Bush Heritage Australia and, of course, Carbon Positive Australia are planting there. But Tina, I don't think I've ever asked you, so I'd love to find out, tell us a little bit more about yourself, how you ended up working in ecology and how you ended up at Eurardy in the beginning.
Well, it's a bit of a story. Don't know where to start, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I finished schooling and ended up working in finance, accounting type roles, not because I was particularly passionate about it, but because I felt like I could work anywhere, could travel with it, and it would sort of be a good opportunity to see the world. And I ended up in Australia almost 20 years ago and was still working in finance, but realized this really wasn't my passion, and always felt very, very, very passionate about conservation, protecting nature, and especially in Australia because, you know, the landscape is so wild and so many places are still untouched. I felt like I really wanted to contribute to conservation of those landscapes, and then made the decision to go back to uni and do an environmental science degree. That was about 10 years ago, and I went all the way to doing a PhD, and that's how I ended up on Eurardy with my husband, looking after the reserve there and the restoration project. And yeah, haven't looked back. It's been one of the best decisions of my life, I think.
And it is, isn't it? It's such a very, very special place. And I would love you just to let our listeners know a little bit about some of the special elements of that place, because I think unless you actually go there, you maybe don't realise just how special it is.
Yeah, so Eurardy is located in WA. It's at the tip of the WA wheat belt, which is sort of a wheat and farming or wheat, sheep and farming sort of landscape. And it's one of the very few pockets where native vegetation is still relatively intact. Only a small proportion of the reserve was cleared, so roughly 30,000 hectares are still in really good nick. It's got two major vegetation types. One is the Congan Heath, and the other one is York Gum Woodlands. And compared to other areas in the WA wheat belt, where most of the vegetation is cleared, more than 90% of the vegetation is cleared really, and even the 10% that are left are not necessarily in good condition. Eurardy has this spectacular landscape with almost 700 native vegetation or plant species, threatened fauna species such as the mellifowl. And yeah, it's just a really, really special place to live and be on.
Yeah, and I know that particularly some of the species there are extremely rare. There's one particular species that I think it was actually thought to be extinct, wasn't it, until about, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, and then they discovered it there.
They've rediscovered a plant species, which they thought was extinct, but they found it on the reserve, which is quite special. And when my husband and I moved to Eurardy, we saw that 10% of the reserve had been cleared for cropping and sheep farming, and we felt very strongly that we wanted to make a difference there and start restoring that landscape that had been degraded.
Yeah, and it's, I think what's so special about it is that mixture, isn't it, between the York Gum Woodlands and then moving on to that sort of Quangan heath. So you've got almost two separate kind of ecosystems kind of going on there at the same time.
Yeah, and it's all driven by soil type. So the York Gum Woodlands are on red loamy soil, and then you've got the heathlands on the yellow soil. So the heathlands are a lot more species rich, quite dense and low vegetation, and the York Gum Woodland has just got really big, tall York gums with sort of shrubby acacia understory, but both special in their own sort of way. And the red soils are predominantly are really good for farming also, because that soil is much better for farming. So a lot of that land is cleared throughout the wheat belt. So we've got a really good patch of intact York Gum Woodlands on Eurardy, which you don't really find many other places anymore.
And I know when we've been doing sort of the planting there, because we've, as you know, planted almost 600 hectares of that red soil and trying to replicate the ecosystem that's there with that red gum planting. And sometimes I often get asked about how much carbon sequestered and all of those kind of things because of the type of vegetation it is. But we know that there are huge things going on underground at Eurardy as well as above ground. So what might look very sparse above ground, there's huge amounts going on below ground. And I know that as part of your PhD studies, you were very much looking at the insect life, weren't you? What goes on kind of underneath.
Yeah, I mean, so carbon is obviously one important, outcome of doing restoration plantings. But there's so much more that's going on in an ecosystem, and there's so many more things that we need to learn about when you plant native vegetation on an area that was cleared and then used for agriculture. So I was particularly interested how the soil chemistry and soil physical condition changes after planting. I was interested in how the composition of invertebrate changes after you've planted native species back on the land. And I was also interested in looking at how the non-woody species respond. So a lot of the biodiverse carbon plantings focus on woody vegetation that is planted.
Yep.
But obviously in an ecosystem, you've also got all the non-woody species that are growing. And I was interested to see what happens with those after a restoration action had taken place. And overall, we do see improvements. Even, you plant woody vegetation on agricultural land, and that's sort of a key and one of the first restoration actions. And we saw that the ants are coming back. The species that live in the woodland come back because you plant trees, and the species that are particularly need trees for their resources, they all come back into the planted area, which is really encouraging to see. We don't quite reach the reference level conditions yet, and that might be a timing issue, or there might be other issues still at place. But we do see other things that come back, and when you plant a native vegetation, which is a really good thing.
I think that's why monitoring is so important, isn't it? And I know you were assisting with some of the monitoring work that we did there, and it just, because you have to, these things take time, don't they? And you have to monitor them over a long period of time to actually work out what's happening there and whether we are being successful or not?
Yeah, so ideally you start with a baseline survey so to know what's there, when you start out. And then ideally every year or at least every 3 years that you measure the changes that are occurring on the land after planting, because if you don't do that, you really have no idea what's happening. You also don't know, the things that aren't potentially going well. So you can't rectify any restoration action that you might want to do. So yeah, monitoring is absolutely crucial, and long-term monitoring in particular. So often projects, only monitor for a year or 5 years and then sort of stop. But it takes a long time for vegetation to develop. Some of the York gums in the intake systems are somewhere between 100 and 300 years old.
Wow.
So ideally, you want to have a very long-term monitoring program that measures the changes of a long time frame. But yeah, we often tend to only work in shorter time frames.
Yeah, and isn't that, I think that's so important, isn't it, to the whole restoration story of being able to have that longer term thinking, and to be able to think forward that, we need to return there sort of in 20 years, 50 years, and actually take almost it out of our own timelines and prepare that information for sort of, the future, for future ecologists who are going to be going there to make sure that they can undertake that work.
Absolutely, yeah. That's how we should set up monitoring programs that for the next generation. Otherwise, we're losing a lot of important information. And a lot of, especially government programs, I think, look at that in a too short a time frame. So it's really sort of intergenerational work that needs to be done then, and we need to look beyond our time frames that we usually work in. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, I know when I went there and I'm looking at this sort of, I'm looking around and I can see the trees are growing and really thriving, but I'm thinking, this is probably not going to be a restored ecosystem in my lifetime. We're doing this and our donors and people that are contributing, and obviously all the Bush Heritage team and the people like yourself, we're all contributing to something that possibly we're not all going to get to see the end of, but at the same time it feels really important to still be doing it.
Yeah, I'd love to go back in 100 years time and see what it looks like.
Wouldn't that be fantastic if we could?
I have to leave it up to my kids and grandkids.
That's it, yeah, we have to leave it up to the next generation.
To do that job. It'll take a long time, and there's very few restoration projects, or maybe even none, where we can already look at that sort of time frame. Restoration is a fairly sort of recent, even scientific discipline. So we haven't got the data yet to really say what happens in 50 or 100 or 200 years time.
And I think that's why, for us as an organisation, it's hugely important to have these sort of longer permanence periods in these restoration projects, so that we know that, those trees aren't going to be taken down during that period where we're actually restoring them over that time. And I suppose, that leads me to thinking about sort of the rural landscape in general. And, I know that you're quite passionate about the rural landscape and how we can restore that in ways that make it functional both for agricultural use, but also for restoration purposes as well.
Yeah.
Everything we do has an impact, from how we commute to work to what we buy at the grocery store. Our lifestyle choices are contributing to our carbon footprint. Did you know Australians have one of the highest personal carbon footprints in the world? The good news is we can change that. Measuring your footprint is easy with our carbon footprint calculator. Custom designed for Australians, it gives you an accurate footprint calculation so you can really know your number. You'll also learn practical everyday ways to reduce and offset the impact of your lifestyle to help combat climate change. You can calculate your footprint at carbonpositiveaustralia.org.au/calculate.
Yeah. So my new project that I'm working with Murdoch University researchers is looking at how restoration can improve natural capital on farm, and in particular at this stage. And we're hoping it's not just beneficial for the environment, which is the main goal sort of to explore, but it can also be beneficial for landholders, that they see what the restored land that they own is actually contributing to society and the environment, and to their own assets that they own.
Can you explain a little bit about natural capital for those of our listeners who might not understand that term? What does that, in a sort of very broad sense, what do we mean when we're talking about natural capital?
So natural capital in a broad sense is really all the stocks and flows, of our ecosystem, of our natural resources that can be either renewable or non-renewable.
Yep.
And it's basically, so when you account for natural capital, you just take stock of all these resources and flows, and put that in an accounting type framework. So you start with an opening balance and you end with a closing balance.
So you've gone back to accounting then, Tina.
Yeah.
Is that what you're accounting with ecology?
That's right. And then you can track the changes over time. So that's the important thing. And you've got it in a standardized framework, basically. And you can do that at a small scale, let's say just at a farm scale or catchment scale, or you can, go bigger look at the state level or even at the federal level. And then you can track the changes in extent, for example, if you wanted to know about York Gum Woodlands. Is the area of York Gum Woodlands in WA increasing or is it decreasing? And then you can also measure condition of the York Gum Woodlands. Is that improving or getting worse? Then you can account for the ecosystem services that those woodlands provide. For example, that would be carbon capture. And then you can also place a dollar value to it, as in what those services provide to society, for example. And I feel passionate about this because, landholders might look after their natural capital on farm because they feel passionate about it, and in particular about, intact landscapes, but they might also want to do it because it has benefits to society, and that should be recognized. And if we don't account for it, so if there's no balance sheet that actually records this, it's really difficult for landholders to show that, some of the actions that they're applying, or some restorations that they apply, that they can provide it to customers or society, basically, or the good things that they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it? Because when we ascribe a value to something and we're actually able to give it a monetary value as well, then that great work that they're doing does have some form of capital. Particularly, I know, we've spoken to sort of landholders in the past, and, they've perhaps done restoration work on their properties. And, what they find is that it in some instances actually devalued the property rather than actually brought value, when we know in reality it's bringing huge value, but because we weren't able to monetize that or put it onto a balance sheet, it's deemed to have decreased the value of the property, which of course is nonsense. That's not really happened.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the thing with placing a monetary value on it, it makes it more accessible or understandable to people who are not ecologists, I suppose, or don't work sort of in the environmental space, because everyone understands the value of money. And if landholders can show this is actually what I'm contributing, it provides them with assets, and it also helps them to show the good work that they're actually doing, rather than devaluing their land when they're planting, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's it. It's so important, isn't it, for the layperson to be able to understand, as you said, what is quite complex work that's taking place on a landholder's property, and also the benefits that are going to flow from that, because it can be really hard to understand how a thriving ecosystem brings value to the wider community. So I love that you're working in a space that's enabling that to happen, so that people can actually, yes, it's dollar values, so maybe that's not the best way, but it's the way that we have at the moment, isn't it, for valuing things? So
yeah, and it comes with, also assessing the extent and the condition and the ecosystem services provide. So it's a whole package. So we don't just focus on the dollar value. It's all those other components as well. So you really get a good understanding of how the ecosystem is tracking. And I personally think, every landholder should be rewarded for applying restoration actions on their farm.
Because it is having wider societal and wider benefits, isn't it, to the general communities in and around where they are. And I suppose I'm going to ask you quite a controversial question now, in a way, in that, it's a question that I get asked all the time, which is, if you're planting trees on agricultural land, are you not taking agricultural land out of production?
I guess it depends on where you plant and what condition that land is in. The idea is to restore land that's fairly degraded, I suppose, where the farmer might not get much return on his investment, or maybe land that's that they haven't planted on for a long time anymore anyway, so they're just sort of sitting there. And in the wheat belt in particular, even if you stop, the cultivation of the land, it won't just come back to its natural state. You have to actually plant species on that land to restore it. So I think restoration, probably should focus on land that's less suitable or no longer suitable for agriculture, which is probably going to increase in the next 50 or 100 years, considering impacts of climate change.
And that's the thing, isn't it? The landscape's changing in terms of the climate as well. So we're not only battling the fact that we've got cleared land that's no longer usable for cropping, we've also got the up and coming climate changes that are going to make more land unsuitable. Whereas the restoration piece is bringing the potential to put that land back to a state where it can thrive.
That's right. And potentially also mitigate climate change impacts.
For over 21 years, Carbon Positive Australia has planted trees and sequestered carbon. Our tree planting increases canopy cover and biodiversity, and also creates positive climate health and well-being outcomes. We take a nature-led approach and are passionate about providing ecologically sensitive planting that protects our environment. We only plant biodiverse native species and specialise in working with landholders to create innovative solutions for carbon planting. We are renowned for our research and monitoring of ecological outcomes. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you can plant trees with us by donating at carbonpositiveaustralia.org.au/donate.
Yeah, and I think as well, I know when we plant, particularly on some of the soils, they're quite degraded by things like salinity, soil erosion, and things that make it unsuitable for cropping on in the first place. But I agree with you. I think it's like it's a balance, isn't it, between understanding the both.
Yeah, and I mean, restoration activities, planting and other things also benefit the cropping area in general, because you attract pollinators, which are important for farming. So it's if you have a landscape, where you don't have any natural vegetation anymore, that's not suitable even for the production side of things either. So, like you say, there has to be a balance between land that's used for farming and land that's still in its natural state.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's, when we're talking about trees, I always use all trees are not created equal, which of course they are in a way, but certainly all restoration projects aren't created equal, in that, when we're looking to plant, we're hoping to introduce as many species and to almost replicate the landscape that was there before. I know that isn't always possible. Can you just tell us a little bit more about why that isn't always possible?
Well, it's really, really difficult to reconstruct the landscape as it used to be before we've cleared it. It's quite straightforward to clear it, because you can just remove the vegetation, but then putting it back together, so the reverse engineering is complicated. So one of the things that makes it difficult is the changed soil condition from 100 years of farming, for example. So the soil chemistry has changed. So carbon is reduced. It's often compacted from machinery and grazing. So that makes it difficult to start with. And then we don't know how to, restore or even grow a lot of the natural species that are occurring in the intact system. So we've probably got a handle on a good amount of species, but not all of them. And for example, the understory I spoke about earlier, there's hardly any projects that actually focus on that. So to get the whole suite of species back into the system is really, really difficult, based on our lack of knowledge and based on the legacies of agriculture, and then also a lack of funding, because it takes a lot of money to try and get everything back into the system, and who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where we're really grateful to our donors, particularly those who are assisting with the Eurardy project, because I think they understand the complexity of what it is we're trying to do there, and and how they're contributing to that is assisting. And yeah, it's so interesting because talking about the different species and types of plants, and I think many people don't understand that to germinate even can take quite a lot of just general understanding in terms of what needs to happen to the seedling, for example, or the seed, whether it needs smoke treatment, whether it needs scarifying. There's all of these elements that we don't always know the answers to.
No, it's very, very complex and complicated, and there's lots of species, and research hasn't figured out all of them yet. So there's lots of work ahead for us to be able to achieve a complete ecosystem restoration, basically.
So if you were to go back, I mean, this is sort of a question, and I think it might be interesting to some of our listeners who may be thinking of, maybe ecology is a career for me. Maybe this is something, that I can help with future generations. What advice would you give somebody who was a budding ecologist and wanted to get, use that as their practical change in the world as coming into this industry?
Well, I'd say definitely go for it and try and get as much experience as you can with different projects, different landscapes, volunteer where you can, speak to lots of different people. So you learn a lot, and B, you find your niche, you find the bit that you're really passionate about, and the bit where you really want to make a difference. And there's lots of projects out there, and there's lots of knowledge gaps. I think we could do with more ecologists and people trying to work out how to restore landscapes, how to understand the systems, how to combat climate change. There's lots of opportunities.
And is there opportunities for those who maybe don't want to go the whole hog and actually, go to university and take degrees and stuff like that, but just want to volunteer and take part in landscape restoration?
Yeah, I mean, Bush Heritage has a volunteer program, so it's worthwhile signing up to that if people are interested in, and that usually involves a whole range of jobs that need to be done, from ecological monitoring, to fencing, to weeding. There's a range of options available, and I'm sure there's tree planting projects where you can sign up to. University PhD students always need volunteers to help them, so people could get an idea of how that side of things works as well. Yeah, once you start looking, there's plenty of opportunities.
Yeah, I think this year in particular, we're doing a few urban projects as well around Perth. So in terms of what's known as Miyawaki forests, which are kind of miniature restoration projects that were created by a Japanese guy called Miyawaki, who we're being helped again by Murdoch University
nice.
to get these projects up and running. So I think there's going to be some opportunities maybe to do restoration at a mini scale. So I'm going to finish, Tina, just by asking you, I suppose, a question that is, what is it that you love most about Western Australian plant and fauna life? What is it that's, what's your real passion there? Is there any particular plant species or animal species that you really love, or is it more general?
I think it's more general, and I get asked that question a lot, like, what's your favourite species? But I really love ecosystems as a whole. And WA in particular, the colours are so vibrant, the patterns are so different. And I find it absolutely spectacular because it's just so diverse, and you drive 100 k's and it looks completely different. But it's also unique at the same time. So I just love it. I just can't get enough of it.
I think we're both really lucky, aren't we, to live in one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world. And
that's right.
Yeah, I'm always amazed by the fact when I talk to people like yourselves, finding out, just how many species are in sort of like a single area of land. And once you start to learn these things, I think you look at the landscape, don't you, with such different eyes.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. Yeah.
Tina, I just want to say a huge thank you today for coming on and telling us all about ecological restoration, sharing your passions with us. And I know you've inspired lots of people to get outside and look a little bit more at our landscapes and find out more. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise.